Hello and welcome to the Sound of Science, the place where we deconstruct unscientific reasoning. Please consider to like and subscribe if you support science. Thanks for watching. Hello, you wonderful people. Today I want to discuss heaven and hell. As you all know, many or most Christians believe that heaven and hell exist. But what are exactly heaven and hell? Well, heaven is the place where good Christians end up after they die. It's a place where they will find rest and peace, and where they will be rewarded for being good Christians. Hell, to the contrary, is the place where sinners end up. You know, those who did not believe in God, had the audacity to eat shellfish, or refused to beat up slaves. So basically, people like myself. You might think I'm joking, but this is kind of what the Bible teaches us about hell. Now, normally, I wouldn't give diddly squat about Bible quotes, because they prove next to nothing. But sometimes Bible quotes are relevant, because it is important to understand what some Christians believe. It's important to understand what they submit to, what they think is reasonable, and what they are prepared to justify at your expense. Here is a nice Bible quote from Revelation 21. Anyone can look it up in the Bible themselves. I don't make this nonsense up. It's all written in the Christian Holy Book. This is what Revelation 21 says about the faithless and the sexually immoral. Their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So basically, if you don't believe in the Christian God, or if you sleep with the wrong person, you deserve to burn in hell for eternity. Remember, this comes from a book that you will find on the cabinet of about every hotel room in the Western world. This comes from a book that hundreds of millions of parents all over the world read from to their children. Here's another nice one from Matthew 25. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire. So, threatening people who do not believe in the Christian God is not enough. Those who decide to terminate their belief in the Christian God should be intimidated as well. As we so often hear from people who first were Christians and then became atheists, many of them are expelled by their own families and threatened by their former friends. Matthew 5 makes it even more ridiculous. Whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. What? I can't even call someone a fool? Even then I deserve to burn in hell? Totally ridiculous. How about Mark 9? And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands go to hell. What? The Bible tells me to cut off my hands if I used them to eat shellfish, or if my hands were engaged in a sexual act that Christians don't approve of? What kind of absurd, extremist dictatorship regime would demand or prohibit this kind of nonsensical rubbish at the cost of being burned forever in hell? How insane must one be to support these kind of atrocities? Luckily, there is no evidence for the existence of heaven and hell, yet Christians believe it anyway. We have no pictures or videos of heaven and hell. There are no verifiable traces of heaven and hell in any way. We have no recordings of sounds coming from heaven and hell. We do not possess objects that came from heaven and hell. We can't detect heaven and hell with ultraviolet or infrared lenses. There is no indication of the location of heaven and hell, so we can't verify their position. We can't measure the distance to heaven and hell. There are no known properties of heaven and hell, like size, shape, capacity, material use, or interior design. because none of that has ever been observed, measured, or established by anyone in any way. There are no consistent and reliable eyewitness accounts of heaven and hell, described by witnesses who actually went there. There is no known concept of how heaven and hell could function, are managed or maintained. If a place needs to facilitate so many people, it should require a huge enterprise, but there is totally nothing that we know about that. So, all we do know is that Christians believe heaven and hell exist, but there is not one shred of evidence whatsoever that would indicate the existence of heaven and hell. Also, the whole concept of heaven and hell doesn't make any sense. If I don't believe in God, and God turns out to exist, He will send me to hell, and there I will be tortured forever. But why? That doesn't make any sense, because don't Christians believe that Satan is in charge of hell? And isn't Satan the enemy of God? Then does God have some kind of business agreement with Satan? And why would Satan torture anyone who rejects his enemy? If I was Satan, I would gladly welcome all of those who reject the God character. I wouldn't torture them, I would include them in my staff and empower them so that we can exchange ideas about how to approach this whole Christian enterprise. Why would Satan spend time on torturing billions of people who he could put to work for his own operation? So God sending people to hell doesn't make any sense. It seems a pretty stupid thing to do. Now, let me show you one of the most clarifying heaven and hell rebuttals I've ever seen. It's given by Ashley Perrion, one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience. Ashley presents a metaphor that very strikingly demonstrates how utterly reprehensible the concept of heaven and hell is. Let's have a look.
Welcome back to the Atheist Experience. I'm your host, Ashley Perrion, and my co-host this week, Don Baker. Welcome back yet again. I walk into a bar with a shotgun, and I go up to the manager and say, got a nice place here. Be a shame if something happened to it. But I tell you what, you give me $50 a week and you'll be okay. Nothing's going to happen to it. Is that fair?
No.
Is that just?
No.
So essentially God's coming down and saying, you know, heck of a life you got there. It'd be a shame if you had to burn in hell for all eternity, isn't it?
No.
But I tell you what, I got my son here. You believe in him, you'll be all right.
Yes, wonderfully phrased by Ashley Perrion. The concept of heaven and hell is basically a Christian vehicle for extortion. Just like criminal gangs do, the Christian belief system threatens all of us with eternal torture. If we join the club, believe in their God, and abide by their rules, we will be left alone or even rewarded. If we don't join their club and reject their God, we will be tortured for eternity. Imagine that, being burned forever. Why? Because you didn't believe something that you thought was nonsense. Who in their right mind would think it is reasonable to torture someone for that, for eternity, by burning you forever? And that is where the real problem lies with heaven and hell. The concept of heaven and hell in itself doesn't bother me so much, because of course I don't think heaven and hell exist. But what does bother me is the people who believe in it and accept it as a reasonable institution, and who worship a God who wants to torture me forever just because of the fact that I don't believe in him. Only an evil madman would want to do something like that. Now, according to some Christians, even other Christians who were born in the wrong families and adopted the wrong Christian denomination are suitable candidates for eternal torture, just for being born in a family that practiced their religion of choice. What if some other religion is right and Christianity turns out to be wrong? Would these Christians then find it reasonable if they themselves were tortured forever just because they believed in the wrong God. I don't think anyone should deserve eternal torture just for worshipping the wrong God or the wrong version of a God. I don't prescribe punishment or torture for anyone. I don't tell them how they should beat up slaves. I don't tell them they should be put to death if they sleep with the wrong people. As far as I'm concerned, theists can believe whatever they want, as long as they leave other people alone. I think anyone should have the freedom to believe in fairy tales, and I should have the freedom to expose that. Having said all of this, I've got some questions left for Christians. Questions about heaven and hell. Maybe there are some Christians in my audience who care to offer a reply to these 4 questions. There goes. Question 1. What evidence do you have for the existence of heaven and hell, other than a Bible quote? Because if you reply with a Bible quote, my follow-up question, of course, will be, what evidence do you have that your Bible quote is true? And then if your answer would be, because the Bible is the Word of God, then my next follow-up question would be, what evidence do you have that your God exists other than a Bible quote? And what evidence do you have that that specific statement of God is true? And of course, I will continue to ask you for evidence until you actually come up with some evidence that makes some sense. My second question about heaven and hell would be, do you think people will be tortured for eternity in hell just because they don't believe in a specific God? And do you think that is reasonable? And if so, if it turns out that not your God but some other God exists, would you then find it reasonable if you were to be tortured forever for not believing in the right God? If you don't think it is true or reasonable that people will be tortured forever in hell for not believing in the right God, then what is it about the concept of heaven and hell you do think is real and reasonable? And what evidence do you have that this is true? My third question about heaven and hell for Christians would be, who created hell in the first place? God did it? Who created the rules that decide who goes to hell? Again, God did it? If so, why would God first create flawed creatures who he then has to torture forever because of the flaws he created himself? You call it free will. And people send themselves to hell because they deny Jesus. Then what is the free part about free will when I will be tortured forever if I exercise my free will? It sounds like a free election where I get shot if I vote for the wrong candidate. And if God did not create hell, then who did? And my fourth and final question to Christians would be, if God would have a day off, if God wouldn't do anything for a day, if God would refrain from any activity for a full day, would people then still end up in hell on that particular day? If so, how has God automated the delivery of people to hell? Has God outsourced the going to hell logistics to some facility management company? And if not, if people are not sent to hell when God refrains from any activity, then wouldn't that mean that you acknowledge that your God actively sends people to hell and that it's his call? He pushes the button and people are not sending themselves to hell. If so, why? Why create creatures with flaws and then punish them forever for these flaws? If that kind of God would really exist, and if he would send people into eternal torture just for not believing in them, then I only have one message for that God, and he can read it on my middle finger. I would never worship a God who sends me into eternal torture for not believing in him. That's not a God, but a cosmic terrorist who doesn't deserve any praise whatsoever. Thanks for listening. I'll see you at the next video.